This is always the exciting part. It's like a slot machine to see all the numbers.
Oh, as they come up, yeah.
Welcome, everyone. It's just 7 o'clock, so we're going to wait just a few minutes for the rest of our audience to arrive. But thank you for joining us. Elizabeth and David, what do you think? Shall we begin?
Sure, let's go ahead.
Okay. Welcome, everybody, this evening. I'm Roy Young, and I'm the president and CEO of the Montpelier Foundation. And I'm very pleased that we're joined tonight by Elizabeth Chu, our executive vice president and chief curator at Montpelier, and our guest author, David O. Stewart, for tonight's book talk. After many years as a trial and appellate lawyer, David O. Stewart became a best-selling writer of history and historical fiction. The Wall Street Journal called his book, George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father, an outstanding biography, with writing that is clear, often superlative, and a narrative drive such a life deserves. His other histories have explored the writing of the Constitution, the gifts of our own James Madison, the outrageous Western expedition and treason trial of the mysterious Aaron Burr, and the impeachment trial of President Andrew Johnson. He has won the Washington Writing Award for Best Book of the Year, the History Prize of the Society of the Cincinnati, and the William H. Prescott Award of the National Society of Colonial Dames of America. David's first novel, The Lincoln Deception, about John Wilkes Booth's conspiracy, was called the best historical novel of 2013 by Bloomberg View. Sequels are The Paris Deception, set at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and The Babe Ruth Deception, which follows the Babe's first 2 years with the Yankees. We look forward tonight to his new thinking on an old subject, the life of George Washington. And I'm personally thrilled to be here tonight to host David. As you all know, I spent a number of years at Mount Vernon, very close to Washington history, and now thrilled to be here very close to Madison history. So I'm thrilled to be able to synthesize the two for you all. So welcome, David. Welcome, Elizabeth, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you, Roy, and thanks everyone for joining us. I encourage you all to ask questions of David, and at any point that they come to you, please put them in either the chat or the Q&A function is fine, actually, and we will hopefully take them as we go along and not wait until the end. And welcome, David. It is wonderful to have you virtually with us at Montpelier. We were chatting a little bit before we started. David was at Montpelier in the fall of 2017, I believe it was, when we opened our new building that's home to the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution, Plogmore Hall. So it's great to have you back, though not on our beautiful site. I'm going to start with an incredibly basic question that I'm sure every single person who's ever talked to you about this book has asked. And that is, with really literally an ocean of ink spilled over the years over General Washington, what inspired you to add to the number?
I have to say, I'm tempted to say, were there other books about Washington? I came to it for two reasons. One was I'd done 3 other books about founders, obviously Madison but also the Constitutional Convention and Aaron Burr, arguably not the most founding of the fathers. And it just started to feel to me like I was walking around the main subject, and that I really should be confronting George Washington, because at the end of the day, he was the most important figure. And for 20 years, he was the most important figure. So I wanted to sort of figure him out. And I came up, you do have to sort of have something to say that has not been said a lot, at least. And I was struck by a fact which others have noticed, which was he won 4 key elections in his career, elected commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, elected president of the Constitutional Convention, elected president twice. But the astonishing thing is he was elected unanimously each time. And you know, you just don't do that with box tops. And he didn't. And you know, it was as remarkable in the 18th century as it would be today if it were ever to happen. And I wanted to sort of scrape away at that and understand how it happened, and how he made it happen. And it emerged to me as a story of really reinvention, that he did not start out intending to be a politician in life, but the plan didn't go as well as he'd hoped, or his first plan, and so he reinvented himself. And he had to learn how to be a politician. He was not a natural. He had several powerful advantages, but he also had some disadvantages that he had to learn how to control. And you know, I think we all sort of go through a process like that in life, you know, learning our strengths and weaknesses and how to strengthen our strengths and control our weaknesses. And he absolutely did. And it was a fascinating process, mostly because he did it so well. I think it's a cautionary tale for everybody.
What would you say his main weaknesses were?
They're related, and he actually, you know, we see him as this marble mythical guy, you know, who just, you know, was never wrong, never told a lie. He's on the dollar bill. He's boring, and you know, there's nothing that, you know, you just dread at spending the evening with him. And instead, I think his biggest problem was his emotions, his passion. He had a terrible temper. And when he lost it, people would talk about it for years afterwards. He tried very hard not to lose it, but he did on occasion, and it was epic. He, as a young man, had a real tendency to snap judgments, and even a certain recklessness. And it did not serve him well. In his initial career, a military career with the Virginia Regiment during the French and Indian War, a career that did not end well. And I think he realized that he needed to manage that. And when you see the mature Washington, he's a remarkably consultative man. He is a great listener. One observer said he's got this ability to find out what the other man thinks without ever disclosing what he thinks. You know, and John Adams describes him as having the gift of silence, which is a gift, of course, Adams never had. And these are all, it seems to me, not natural to Washington. He had to learn how to do that. I think he always did have, and it's a related thing, he is a very emotionally accessible guy. Again, not how we think of him, but he was great at connecting with people. Part of it's listening. You know, whenever you meet someone and they do all the talking. They think they've had a great time, which is what I'm doing right now. So I'll stop. Uh, but I think he was very good at that. And he was emotionally accessible. Something I got surprised by is the number of times he wept in public. And he wasn't embarrassed about that. He was a man of feeling, and he was willing to show it.
Well, we are here today to listen to you, so don't worry about it.
Well, that's very generous, but I know I can overdo it.
So I admire many things about your book. And one big one for me that I really admire is that you don't in any way look at him as you put it, this marble guy. I think that we Americans like our heroes, and we generally like them self-made. And Washington was already this mythical figure before he became president. But I think the way you build up your narrative, you do a wonderful job of showing that he neither sprung fully formed from the head of Zeus, nor totally made himself. So can you talk about his own family background, and particularly his connection with the Fairfax family that was so important in launching his career?
Sure, and you know, that's another thing. You know, we tend to say, okay, this guy was tall, he was rich, he married a woman who was way richer than he was. You know, this was easy, and he was tall, no question about that. But you know, he wasn't rich. He came from a second-tier gentry family. They had some land, good land. Not the best, but good, but he didn't get it. It went to his older brothers. His father died when he was 11 and really left his mother home with a single mother of 5 little kids. And she was scrambling to raise these kids and to give them the start in Virginia society that she wanted to. There was no money to educate George the way his older brothers had been. He was always self-conscious and embarrassed about his lack of formal education. And he went to work as a teenager at 16. He's working as a surveyor. It's a very different trajectory from, you know, young men like Madison or Jefferson, who really did come from very wealthy families. The Washingtons were, you know, better off than most of the people in Virginia, but it wasn't easy. And a critical part of his success, well, there's really 2 pieces. I always try to emphasize his elder brother, Lawrence, who was 14 years older and a half brother, who really took him under his wing. And Lawrence was clearly a young man of great promise and ambition and talent. And likely would have made quite a place for himself and was in the process of doing it, but that he developed tuberculosis and died in his early 30s, a very sad end. But he had married into the Fairfax family, which lived next door to the property which became Mount Vernon. It was called Little Hunting Creek at the time. And with the Fairfaxes at Belvoir, which is the property is now Fort Belvoir in Virginia, Washington really acquired just invaluable sponsors as well as mentors, particularly Colonel William Fairfax. And Colonel Fairfax helped him get his early jobs in the colonial government. Colonel Fairfax sat on the executive council, which was powerful. The Fairfax family owned most of Northern Virginia. Their holdings were the equivalent of the state of New Hampshire, just to give you a sense of the size. And so they were, you know, rich beyond imagination. They were well-bred, been educated in England. And Washington learned how to be a gentleman from them. With his father gone, he would have had not the model that you would and sponsor you would want in life. And Colonel Fairfax really did take him on. And there are wonderful moments when the colonel offers advice. Washington has a very bad experience leading the Virginia Regiment in the French and Indian War at this Battle of the Great Meadows. And he should not have engaged in the battle. It was a bad place, bad circumstance, and he should have just skedaddled, gotten his men out of there. And Colonel Fairfax writes him this wonderfully gentle letter afterwards saying, George, the Duke of Marlborough had many withdrawals, and they were not retreats. It's okay to decline battle if you're in a bad position. And it was a nice touch, and it allowed a feel for how the Fairfaxes looked after George, and they did. His first couple of runs for the House of Burgesses, when he leaves the military, turn on Fairfax support. I think I refer to one as a festival of Fairfaxes. They really were essential to his launching. At some level, he was their greatest achievement.
Wow. I'm writing that down. That is that's a great line. Now, they later leave before the revolution. Were they loyalists, or why did they go back to England?
Well, there's a lot of Fairfaxes. And there are several in George's generation. And the central one to him is George William Fairfax, who's just 7 years older. And if I had to say who was his best friend through life, I think it would be George William Fairfax. And George William had to leave for litigious matters. There was an inheritance issue back in London. He left before the war broke out. And he seems to have had very strong pro-American sympathies. His correspondence before the war suggests that he can't believe that British policy. He thinks they're stupid, that they're alienating the Americans. He has a couple of brothers still in America who stay through the war, and as well as his uncle, Lord Fairfax, who's the guy who actually owned all the land. Lord Fairfax keeps his head down. He's just trying to make some money. He stays out of the politics. Brian Fairfax, who is a friend of George's, and they could do a fair amount of fox hunting together, tries to talk George away from being so adamantly anti-British, and tries to get him to take a more compromising stand with the British. And George Washington writes him a couple of just stern letters saying, we have had it, and I have had it, and I'm not putting up with this anymore. The British have done everything to insult us and to take away our liberties, and we're not going to put up with it. So I think Brian was sort of more pro-British. Ironically, he's the one still in America. And his brother, George William, back in England, is actually more pro-American. So there are Fairfax is all about. There's actually another, I couldn't recreate it on the fly here. There's another Fairfax who marries another Washington, a cousin of George. So there's a lot of intermarriage and interconnection between the two families.
And so, I mean, as you say so beautifully, so important to his career. You touched on this briefly, but we often hear about Washington having nowhere near the formal classical education of Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. Do you think that held him back, or could it possibly have ever been an advantage for him?
It's a chicken and egg thing, because the guy he was, and you see his there are a couple of copybooks from his school days. He did have some instruction. Reveal him as we know him, frankly, which is a practical man, a man who knows his numbers. He's extremely good at mathematics, geometry, algebra. He does master those. And he has no languages. Not having Latin and Greek probably didn't hold him back a whole lot, but not having French was a problem. The British officers spoke French to each other, and he couldn't. And it labeled him as a colonial. And at this one key battle I mentioned, he signs a treaty with the French, and he doesn't quite know what's in it. And he's relying on his translator, and later he blames his translator for not telling him what was in it. And we don't have time to worry about that. But clearly, that was an inhibition. And his knowledge of sort of the political philosophy of the time, which was a great focus for people like Madison and Jefferson, it is not deep. I'm not sure it ever held him back. He was a gifted sort of politician on the hoof, and he didn't need to think, the deep thoughts in the same way. He was not a natural writer, although he got better. But and I think by his later years, he's actually rather good, but he has no confidence in himself. So he always relies on someone else to write things up, important things up. So for a while, it's George Mason, his neighbor at Gunston Hall. And then it's Madison for almost 10 years. And Hamilton performs that function in later years. So that's a reflection of his own modesty and insecurity. Again, I'm not sure it would have made a lot of difference. If he had frankly, probably freed up a little time, so you didn't have to worry about producing the first draft.
In January, we spoke with Tom Ricks about his new book, First Principles, about what the founders learned from the ancient world. And he mentioned, or he starts his book off with something that you also mentioned, which is Washington having a performance of Addison's Cato at Valley Forge, which I just think, first of all, I'm fascinated by Washington's love of theater, but the way that he would gain access to these important ancient, Republican heroes and writers via another medium, I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, the obsession with Cato is something that fascinates me because it was also Andrew Johnson's favorite play.
Wow.
So, which is a bizarre connection. And I want to now make the suggestion to the powers at Montpelier, as I have at Mount Vernon, to no effect, which is nobody performs Cato anymore. I don't think it has been performed for 100 years. Tom?
David, I would say that we did perform a version in the upper garden at Mount Vernon, which was remembrances of Cato. And so Dean Melissa actually performed a few scenes from Cato, but not in its entirety. You're right. But it was very well received.
I would, no, well, I hate to say this in public, I would pay a little money to go see Cato perform. Because it is a lost work. And it clearly resonated powerfully with Washington in particular, but with his whole generation. And we don't have much appreciation for it since I think it has to be performed. I've tried to read it and it reads not great to the modern ear. Mm-hmm.
Well, duly noted. we will I think it's a great idea.
I'll drive to Orange for that.
Great. So as you sort of look at all the different aspects of Washington's background that, you know, sort of propel him forward, you also really carefully examine how he built his career after his launch, you know, outside of Mount Vernon, that is, from his time as a surveyor and the Virginia Regiment in the French and Indian War, then in the House of Burgesses, the Fairfax County Court, and then sort of getting into his, you know, his joining in the rebellion against Britain, and really that leads to. Is there, of all these different things, I mean, they're all obviously important. Is there anything that kind of stands above another of these experiences for him as preparing him for, you know, what he does later?
If I had to pick one, I would say the House of Burgesses. He served there so long, 15, 16 years. And he's a rather indifferent legislator at first. He's not even that diligent. He misses a few sessions here and there. He's much more focused on trying to get Mount Vernon to be a paying enterprise, which is hard. He has trouble with that, and he does convert it into a very successful enterprise. But I think he had the opportunity over an extended period of time to build political relationships, to see how political operators, and good ones, like, and these are Virginia names, not everyone will know, but like the Speaker John Robinson, his successor Peyton Randolph, Edmund Pendleton, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, see how really talented political people functioned. And, you know, some did it by oratory. There were some Burgesses who were extremely prominent just because they were so darned rich. And Washington didn't really have either of those roads. So he had to sort of come up with his own notion of how he would become a valued member of the legislature. And he does it, it's sort of a quiet way. He's not an orator. He doesn't have the command of words that requires, and he also doesn't have the voice. He has a rather breathy, unimpressive voice. So he speaks very short, very briefly, and not in a flowery fashion, but I think he builds trust. He shows his diligence, his willingness to take jobs on. What's a constant in Washington's life, you get from other people when they deal with him, is they just can't believe how much work he gets done. He is the hardest working man. The old soul singer James Brown was the hardest working man in show business. George Washington was the hardest working man at the founding. And he, people value that. You know, he got stuff done. And I think he is, through this time, learning, if I can harken back to where we started, learning how to draw on other people, how to get a group to work together, and how to use other talents he doesn't have, and harness them to his own purpose. And, you know, see how coalitions are formed, how you change opinions, you know, which is the toughest thing in politics and arguably the most important. I would focus on that. I think the county court experience was very important as well, because it's local government, and everybody knows there's nothing more vicious than local government. So he had to figure out where to put the roads. I mean, you could really get into arguments over that. But I think the Burgesses was just a great training ground.
Elizabeth, can I jump in for a quick second?
Please.
Thank you. So David, as I'm listening, I hear you sort of touching on my question here and again. But I remember the first time I had heard that Washington considered himself a Virginia planter. he did not consider himself necessarily a war hero the way other people did, or an accomplished politician. And I'm curious, based on your research, how you think Washington might react to your reference that he was a politician, because I think he sees himself in a very sort of grounded and perhaps more, simple's not the right word, but as you said, Mount Vernon's always in his mind. He always wants to make it successful. He calls it his beloved Mount Vernon, the most perfectly situated estate in all of America. There's he's in love with Mount Vernon and with his life there.
That's certainly true. And when his great triumphs of resignation, when he leaves jobs and earns everybody's trust, when he leaves the army in 1783 and then he leaves the presidency in 1797. I'm often asked, so were those just ploys? And my answer is always absolutely not. He wanted to go home.
Exactly.
He really liked it there. So that's true. But you're leading into what I think is, for me, what really came through is Washington's wonderful triumph is that we don't think of him as a politician. I mean,
right.
That's a grand slam. You get to exercise political power and leadership for 20 years, and you go home and everybody says, God, that guy was a great soldier and what a good farmer he is. So, he would certainly deny that he was a politician.
Right.
He'd say, oh, he had to get dragged into it, which is not true. But it was, he understood, being called a politician has never, since the beginning of time, has never been a positive. And he would, he was great at what we would call branding today, establishing his image, his attention to his clothes, to his appearance, to his presentation. And it would never have been as a politician, and that was the magic.
Thank you.
So, because of where we are, we of course have to talk about Washington and Madison. But before we get there, actually, I want to just talk about the Revolution a little bit. I am absolutely no expert on the Revolution, but I'm really interested. I had literally, this is maybe embarrassing to admit, I'd never heard of the Conway Cabal before I read your book. Obviously had heard of the Newburgh conspiracy. And I don't mean to just be bringing up the negative things, but I mean, is it just human nature that even leaders like Washington have that kind of opposition? What do you make of those two situations?
The Conway Cabal is what a group of senior officers tried to move him out as commander-in-chief in 1778, and the Newburgh Mutiny isn't the end of the war. The officers haven't been paid, and they're talking mutiny. And there are a couple of small mutinies. And it's really important for us to remember just how badly treated the Army was. They, were only occasionally paid, if at all. Food was hard to come by. Clothes, blankets, and you got sick and died a lot. So it was nasty, tough service. And so the Conway Cabal is really during Valley Forge. It's a low period for Washington. He hasn't won a battle for a year. He's lost a couple of big ones. And Horatio Gates has won a giant battle at Saratoga. So there are some people who start saying, well, gee, shouldn't Gates be the guy? And it's not a crazy question. And I think it's very impressive, and I describe it at some length, how Washington fends it off. But, this is at Valley Forge, and, you just want to weep when you read what the soldiers go through. And they, the officers would say, I don't know why they don't all desert. I don't know why they don't just all go home or mutiny. I mean, they just couldn't understand it. And I think that is a tribute at some level, in significant part, not entirely, but to Washington's leadership, that he was able to command their loyalty. He always had the ability to command the loyalty of the soldiers he led. And his attention to their needs, even when he had no resources to serve them. They felt that he was doing the best he could. So, it's and he manages both of those crises, and they are crises. And that is the mark of a great politician. I've been reminded by a couple of people that, people say, well, he was just a general. And I have been reminded that there is no military bureaucracy in the world that is not highly political. And that military people get very good at politics.
And I think you do a really good job also of sort of painting the picture that of the end of the war, the end of the revolution. It really wasn't, all fireworks and balls and celebration. It was actually really, really difficult. And nothing that we know now that happened was any kind of foregone conclusion. And so, this really difficult time with the Articles of Confederation leading up to the convention. So of course, that's when the relationship between Madison and Washington becomes important. We know that they first meet obviously in 1781 when Washington stops in Philadelphia on the way to Yorktown to meet with Congress, when, Congressman Madison. And then they both work together on river navigation issues. And then the amazing work with the convention, but the end of all of it is really complicated. I mean, they're so close. Madison is his ghostwriter, as you said, but then, with the rise of the party system, it all falls apart. So this is a gigantic question, but can you sort of talk about kind of the arc and the ebb and flow of this really important relationship?
Sure, and it's one I've thought about a good deal because it is a section of my book, Madison's Gift, where I talk about Madison's 5 key partnerships, one of which is with Washington. And you need to understand that they were never peers. Washington is 24 years older, I think, and he's the hero when Madison meets him. Madison's a young guy who's, just whip smart, and Washington liked that in people. He liked having people around him who were smart, and he made an effort to make that happen. So they do fall into a partnership. They are Virginians, and I think that's part of the bond, although, Washington has an almost comparable bond with Hamilton, who couldn't be more different. But I do think that's part of it. And the toughest thing to unpack is the falling out. And it's not an explosive falling out. And it always interests me that, Jefferson and Madison go off and form the Republican interest, which becomes the Republican Party, which is the opposition. And Washington clearly is just bitter about Jefferson. And Jefferson kind of snipes at Washington in some of his private writings that, of course, were designed to survive, so we would read them. But you don't find that edge in the distance that comes between Madison and Washington. I think part of that may be that Jefferson was in the family, he was in the cabinet, and he was working against Washington at the same time. And that felt like a betrayal and a lack of good faith that Washington really couldn't overlook. Whereas Madison's in the House of Representatives. And so his opposition is open. He disagrees with Washington on policy. And Washington may not like that, but at least it's honorable. It's okay. You disagree with me. You've been a great aid to me. I'm going to miss you. It's sort of how it turns out. And, even after they have fallen out, Washington tries to appoint him ambassador to France. So he clearly still has confidence in him. They are not, they've been so close, just hand in glove for 5 years at least. Madison is his closest confidant. And that does fall away. The best explanation I've ever come to for myself is I think Madison causes the distance. There is a tendency in the literature, if I can use the phrase, to portray Madison as Jefferson's little brother or his caddy. And I hate that. And I actually think Madison led Jefferson a lot. But when there is this falling out, really comes because Madison is looking at what Washington is doing with the presidency. And it might have just been, I think it was a misjudgment by Madison. He didn't appreciate just how powerful Washington was going to be able to make the presidency. And that wasn't what Madison had in mind. Underestimating Washington was not his best moment. You shouldn't underestimate Washington. But I think he was surprised. He thought of the executive branch as not terribly significant. And it turned out it was going to be very significant. And part of it was because Washington was the president. And I think that's when Madison starts to fall away. Now, it's often portrayed as, his disenchantment with Hamilton and his financial program, which is certainly part of it. But, it's the point I try to make in the book is we always call it Hamilton's financial program, but it was Washington's financial program. He was the president and he approved it and it was his policy. And, it was just convenient for Madison to blame Hamilton. You always blame the guy farther down that you don't want to get the big guy angry with you. Madison was far too smooth to walk into that one. So I think there was an openness about the disagreement that Washington was willing to credit. And you don't find the ill feeling between Washington and Madison that you do find between Jefferson and Washington.
So that's going to lead me to what I'm going to call the room where it happened question. Okay, so the Compromise of 1790.
Yeah.
So complicated. And so basically it's the political maneuvering wherein the capital, the new capital city comes to the Potomac and the federal government assumes the Revolutionary War debt. Now, I had previously believed in the, private dinner between Madison, Jefferson, and Hamilton, in which the deal was struck, but you say that you think that's something that Jefferson made up and just wrote about later. How do you think it all went down? And do you think Washington has really the biggest role that we haven't appreciated?
Yes, I do think that. And I don't want to, portray Jefferson as totally fiendish on this. I suspect there was a dinner and they talked about the deal. Nobody I'm trying to remember, this was in Philadelphia, nobody had around the government had talked about anything else but this deal for at least 60 days. I mean, it was out there to be struck and just nobody could get it to work. There were just too many moving parts, too many shifting alliances. And every time somebody thought he had the deal, it would fall apart. And my reading of the sequence is after, about half of that time, the man in the president's chair said, you guys aren't going to get it done. I need to be involved. And he starts sending his personal emissaries, this fellow, William Jackson, and the Treasury people and Hamilton and Jefferson. And I keep trying to emphasize, Hamilton and Jefferson worked for him. They answered to him. So if they're out making a deal, it's because the guy back in the main office wants them to. And he even shows his hand, and this is something people don't pay much attention to, and is closeted with one of the Massachusetts congressmen who is a key player and plainly is lobbying him and advocating with him. He even, again, a thing I hadn't seen people put together, right before the final deal is struck, Washington goes fishing with Hamilton and Jefferson off New Jersey for 3 days. Now, these guys did not hang out with each other. They were not that kind of friends. And this was not an accident. Washington wanted to get them together and get them on the same page and make it happen. And my final point is simply, the deal was, of course, that the financial plan goes through and the capital goes to the Potomac. And Jefferson loves having the capital on the Potomac, and he's not crazy about the financial plan. Hamilton hates having the capital on the Potomac. He's batty about the financial plan. There's only one guy who got everything, and that's George Washington. So, maybe he was behind it, huh? What do you think?
Yeah, that is so true. So you also do a really good job showing Washington's interest throughout his life in land acquisition, land speculation. And this is a question just out of pure ignorance. Did he make any money on the capital coming to the Potomac?
I don't think so. He had no lands in what became the District of Columbia. He would have had, I guess he had some land that would have been on the Virginia side, which did remain as part of the district until the 1840s. But he wasn't selling any of those lands. His land speculation efforts, which were a major activity of his between the wars, in his late years, he just said, "Oh my God, what a mess! That was one of the worst ideas I ever had." And he didn't make any money on his land speculation. So I'm inclined to think not. He did actually contract again in his late years to build a couple of buildings in the District of Columbia to show support, and he had to take out a bank loan to do it. He just was always cash poor and land rich. So no, I don't think he cashed in, but I think he thought it was very cool that it was going to be across the river from where he was. Yes. And they named it Washington while he was still alive, and he didn't argue about that.
And then but he never lived to see even the Adamses move, move down there.
No, although I don't think it would have, it wasn't a very nice place for quite a few years.
Yeah. Right. So, I want to encourage all of you out there in the audience to please put some questions either in the chat or the Q&A. And we really want to hear what you're interested in hearing David talk about. Well, I want to move on to the topic of slavery. You also do really great job of talking about the evolution of his thinking, and the fact that for all of the Southern founders, slavery surrounded them from the moment they were born. But for Washington, being married to a wealthy widow, he has this really complicated situation with dower slaves that really belonged to Martha, but mostly to her grandchildren. So what actually does end up happening once he dies? I can never really been able to figure out if anybody is ever actually freed.
His slaves are freed.
Okay. But there are not very many of them, right?
Pardon me?
There are not very many slaves that just belong to him.
Oh, it's more than 100.
Oh, okay, all right, that's a lot.
It's a pretty significant crowd. And he leaves enough money to educate the children and to take care of the old ones in their late years. So that goes according to plan. The dower slaves, which derive from Daniel Custis, Martha's first husband, have to be preserved for the benefit of her grandchildren. And they are handed over to her grandchildren. One of her grandchildren emancipates a number of those slaves. Don't hold me to a number, but it could be as many as a dozen. And there are a few others who are favorites who get emancipated. Wash Custis emancipates a couple. So it's not awful, but it's not a good story. And there's a little piece of the will I was able to track down. It turns out Washington had taken 30-some slaves as security on a loan that he made to one of Martha's brothers. And the slaves were working on Custis lands. And Washington directed his executors, when the widow died of Martha's brother, that the estate should refuse to accept repayment and simply keep the slaves and free them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another 30-some slaves that eventually get freed. Now, I couldn't tell you when. It probably took a few years. So you probably get up close to 150.
Okay.
But there's lots who do not get freed.
Right. And what do you make of his pursuit of Ona Judge, Martha, an enslaved maid of Martha's that he tries to capture for years?
It's pretty ugly, and I don't know exactly what to make of it. There's of course a recent book on the subject. I think he insisted that he wanted to see an end to slavery, but he could be very inconsistent on the subject. And if his financial interests were at stake, he could trim his views on that. There is chat in the literature about trying to blame Martha for the pursuit of Ona Judge, because Ona worked for Martha, and Martha, there's no evidence that Martha ever she seems to have had very conventional views of the white slave owning class. I didn't investigate that a lot, and I'm not sure what to think of it. I think blaming the woman is pretty easy. You know, it's an unpleasant story because he uses subterfuge and tries to deceive her to get her back. And it's not the only time. You know, Mary Thompson's book on this subject, the title of which is too complicated for me to recite, Only Unavoidable Subject of Regret.
Yeah.
You know, she faces up to it and she says, you know, anything bad that could happen to a slave happened to a slave at Mount Vernon. And it's important for us to remember, you know, Washington actually spent a few years trying to be a good slave owner, and he kind of gave it up. You know, you can't. You know, he above all slave owners wanted to get the work done, and you know, for a slave, there's just no percentage in working. I mean, there's just no point to it. So you have this fundamental conflict that can't be resolved except with force.
And if I could just add something there, which is that when Washington's slaves are eventually freed, it creates even greater hardship in certain ways because family members were of both families' slave ownership. And so just because you were freed, that doesn't mean your children or your spouse might have been freed. And so,
that's exactly right. It was complex and awkward, and some of the freed slaves would stay.
Right.
And it doesn't get better when Bushrod takes over Mount Vernon. So
exactly.
So we have a question from Kristen. And she asks, do you think Washington would have remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War or his beloved Mount Vernon in Virginia?
Well, you know, the Union troops held Mount Vernon, and it was actually declared a neutral territory between the armies, and both sets of soldiers would tour it out of interest. Yeah, I think he would have stayed with the Union. It's what he lived and died for, was the country, and his feelings about slavery was sufficiently complex that I could not imagine he would find that a good reason to break up the nation.
Any more questions? It's time to put it into the chat or Q&A. I'm gonna just ask you one more myself, which is what's next for you? What's your next project?
Well, I'm looking at a topic which is not ready for prime time, so I'll punt that one. But I do have there are 3 novels I've written inspired by my mother's family's history. They're historical novels, but not from the series I did before that Roy had mentioned. And they will, the first one will launch in November. And that involves German settlers coming to the Maine coast in the 1750s and the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. And the second book is Civil War years, and the third book is World War II years. And it's fiction. My mother was the original unreliable narrator. You could not believe stories she told you about yesterday. But she was a great storyteller. It's been something I've wanted to do for many years.
Are these out now?
The first one comes out in November.
Oh, great. Well, something to look forward to. Well, David, I think you've really done what, something very difficult, which is to create a really rich and nuanced examination of Washington, bringing out a lot of really smart observations and just this sort of summation of him as this master politician. So congratulations on the book. I I said to you earlier, I think you're a beautiful, wonderful writer, and look forward to what's coming up next. Oh, here's Steve says, what do you find more rewarding, writing, fiction or history?
Yes.
I somehow knew that was going to be the answer.
Yeah, I wouldn't do both if I didn't like them both. They're different itches, and it's great to be able to scratch both of them.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, Elizabeth. I really enjoyed the hour with you.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next month for the virtual book club. Bye-bye.
Take care.